Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. You're out of this house tonight. The landlord's voice boomed, echoing in the small, sparsely furnished living room. He then turned his venomous glare on the old man kneeling on the floor. "And you, old man, stop playing with that rusty lock and get out." The old locksmith's only crime had been to offer his help, for free, to the grieving widow of a fallen soldier. But what that cruel landlord didn't know was that the old, rusty footlocker held a secret that would not only save the family, but would also bring about his own spectacular downfall. Elias Thorne was a man who understood secrets. At 75, he was the proprietor of the Patient Hand, a dusty, forgotten locksmith shop that smelled of brass shavings and old oil. His hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, moved with a delicate, unwavering grace. To the few customers who still sought out his old-world craftsmanship, he was just a quiet, gentle old man who could fix anything. But the truth was, before he was a locksmith, Elias had been a Master Chief Petty Officer in the U.S. Navy, serving as a Master Cryptographer. He had spent 30 years in a world of silent, high-stakes puzzles, deciphering codes that could shift the tides of conflict. He had learned that the most complex locks were not made of metal, but of secrets and lies. After retiring, he had sought a quieter life, a life of tangible puzzles he could solve with his hands. But the loss of his own son, a young sailor lost at sea during a training exercise, had instilled in him a quiet, fierce protectiveness over all military families. He saw his own loss reflected in their eyes, and he had made a silent vow to help any of them in any way he could. That vow was about to be tested. He had received a call from a young woman named Maria Ramirez. Her voice was quiet, broken with grief. Her husband, Army Sergeant Daniel Ramirez, had been killed in action 6 months prior. She explained that she was being evicted from her rental home, and the only thing she wanted to take with her was her husband's old military footlocker. But the key was lost, and the lock was rusted shut. She had no money to pay, but she was desperate. For Elias, there was no hesitation. He closed his shop for the day and drove to her address. He arrived to a scene of quiet heartbreak. A young boy, no older than 5, was sitting on the porch steps, clutching a small toy soldier. Maria, his mother, had tears in her eyes as she looked at the eviction notice nailed to her door. Their landlord, a greedy, predatory man named Silas Blackwood, wanted to sell the property to developers and was using a minor late rent payment as an excuse to throw them out. Inside, Elias saw the footlocker. It was an old, heavy-duty military chest, dented and scarred from deployments, and on the front was a lock he recognized immediately. It wasn't a standard padlock. It was a custom high-security naval lock, the kind used for sensitive equipment, and it featured a complex 5-pin tumbler system that was also a coded mechanism. As Elias knelt, his experienced fingers tracing the outline of the lock, the front door burst open. Silas Blackwood stormed in, his face a mask of cruel impatience. That's when he delivered his ultimatum. "You're out of this house tonight. I have the sheriff on his way, and you, old man, stop playing with that rusty lock and get out." Elias didn't even look up. "This family has a right to their property," he said, his voice calm but firm. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This property is junk, and it's in my house. You have 1 hour." He then stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Elias turned back to the lock. This was no longer just a job. It was a mission. He opened his kit, his old, familiar tools feeling like extensions of his own hands. He knew brute force would be useless. This was a puzzle. This was a code. But you won't believe this. As he began to work, he realized the tumblers weren't random. They corresponded to a 5-letter naval code sequence. He closed his eyes, his mind racing through old protocols, old memories. He tried a common code, then another. Nothing. He then thought about the soldier, Sergeant Ramirez. What would be important to him? A name? A place? He looked over at the small boy, Leo, who was now watching him with wide, curious eyes. "What was your father's call sign, son?" Elias asked gently. The boy's face lit up. He called himself Guardian, Leo whispered. Elias's old hands moved with a sudden certainty. G-U-O-R-D. The tumblers clicked into place, one by one. But the fifth one wouldn't turn. It wasn't Guardian. It was something else. He was missing a piece of the puzzle. Dejected, he was about to give up when Maria handed him a small framed photo. It was of her husband Daniel and his entire platoon. Underneath, a handwritten caption read, "The Guardians of Outpost Phoenix." Elias's eyes widened. P-H-O-E-and-I-X. He tried another sequence, then another. He realized it wasn't a word, it was a pattern. It was a cipher. The skills he hadn't used in 20 years came flooding back. He hadn't seen the biggest surprise yet. With a final, satisfying thunk, the lock sprang open. Maria gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, preserved perfectly, was not just old uniforms and medals. On top of a neatly folded flag was a thick, leather-bound journal. Maria opened it to the last entry. As she read her husband's final words aloud, her voice choked with tears. The journal detailed his final mission. He had discovered that their intelligence was flawed, that his entire platoon was walking into a sophisticated ambush. With his communications jammed, he had disobeyed a direct order to hold his position. He had single-handedly created a diversion, drawing enemy fire onto himself, allowing his entire 30-man platoon to escape. He had died saving them all, but because he had disobeyed a direct order, his official record had been marked with a hint of misconduct, denying him the Medal of Honor he so clearly deserved. Tucked inside the journal was the damaged radio transponder that proved the communications had been jammed, and a hand-drawn map showing the corrected enemy positions. This chest didn't just contain memories. It contained proof. It contained his honor, and it was at this exact moment that everything changed. The front door burst open again. It was Blackwood with 2 sheriff's deputies behind him. "Time's up," he sneered. "Get out, all of you." Maria stood up, clutching the journal to her chest. "You can't do this," she said, her voice no longer timid but filled with a new strength. "This is the home of a hero," Blackwood laughed. "He was just a soldier. And this is my property." But before the deputies could take a step, a black, official-looking vehicle pulled up to the curb with a quiet, intimidating presence. A man in a full Army colonel's uniform stepped out. He was Colonel James Corbin. He walked up the porch steps, his eyes finding Maria, then Elias, and finally the open footlocker. "Mrs. Ramirez?" he asked, his voice full of a respectful gentleness. "I'm Colonel Corbin. I was your husband's commanding officer. We've been searching for this footlocker for 6 months. Blackwood's arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of utter confusion. The colonel turned to him, his expression now like ice. "Sergeant Daniel Ramirez," the colonel stated, his voice ringing with authority, "saved the lives of 30 men under my command. He was one of the bravest soldiers I have ever known. The proof of his final actions, which we believed was lost forever, was in that chest. Proof that will see him posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor." He then looked at the eviction notice, then back at Blackwood. "And you're trying to evict his family from their home?" The deputies took a subconscious step back from Blackwood. The landlord's face was ashen. He had not just been a bully, he had desecrated the memory of a national hero. His reputation in the small, military-friendly town was over. The colonel wasn't finished. He looked at Elias, who was quietly packing his tools. "And you," he said, extending a hand. "I don't know who you are, sir, but you just served this country as well." Elias simply shook his hand. "Just helping a sailor's family, Colonel." The colonel, a career officer, saw something in the old man's eyes, a quiet, familiar authority. He knew this was no ordinary locksmith, but that was a secret for another day. Thanks to the colonel, the Ramirez family didn't lose their home. A foundation started by Daniel's old platoon bought the house for them. And Elias Thorne, the quiet guardian of secrets, went back to his dusty shop. His own promise to a fallen soldier's family fulfilled, another puzzle solved. Another secret brought to light. Kindness and merit are recorded, even when they go unnoticed. To continue hearing stories that prove it, don't forget to follow the Merit Ledger and leave a comment about a time when a small act of kindness made a huge difference. Because every life is a record worth reading.